Joining us today from London is Al Jazeera presenter and correspondent Barbara Serra. Barbara, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, Barbara, we're going to talk about narratives, we're going to talk about migration, we're going to talk about the Mediterranean area in particular, and I would like to have your thoughts on a few things, especially, we're going through a particular time, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen how, in particular, certain narratives, sometimes stigmatizing migrants, have been detected in a way that even the WHO has been talking about a new phenomenon called disinfodemic or misinfodemic. Now, when it comes to migration, like we see that this phenomenon is often seen as a threat rather than an opportunity, is a very polarizing topic. What is, in your opinion, the role of the media in rebalancing this misinfodemic phenomenon?
I think the role of the media is always the same in the sense that it's finding the truth, telling that truth, communicating it, and also disproving untruths that may be around, or at the very least giving context. I do think the whole coronavirus crisis has obviously heightened certain difficulties. We can see that there is a general sense of fear and uncertainty that's among everyone really right now, and that is also having an impact on some of the narratives and the response to them in our audiences. I think what journalists can do is sort of tell the truth and be wary of language and images. We heard Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, for a long time. He still does it now. Talk about the Chinese virus when it started. We did hear across Europe of racist incidents against people of an Asian background. So there was a fear that often mixed with ignorance leads to that. It was very interesting in Italy, though, when it comes to public opinion. Then when the focus of COVID-19 was on Italy, and many Italians found themselves being stigmatized abroad and a lot of travel being stopped, it's interesting how then they realized how often unfair that could be. I think there's always an element of truth in the sense that we did have high cases. It did originate from Wuhan. We did have high cases in Italy. I think journalists, beyond telling the truth, have to be careful about some things that could happen without meaning to. So, for example, I noticed that for a long time, because the disease started in Wuhan, and certainly China is where we heard about it first, in the background, so, when you have a TV studio, in the background, there would be images of Chinese people and the Chinese context. And that continued for not much longer, but for a while, when after it became obvious it wasn't just a Chinese issue. So it's little things like that that sometimes can happen by mistake that could almost cement certain views. But otherwise, it's really just telling the truth, sticking to the facts, making it very clear, and trying to gain the trust of an audience, which at that point, and even now, is pretty scared.
That's very interesting. So let's look more into the life of a journalist today. So do you think that the COVID-19 and the consequent lockdown and the travel restrictions, you think this will change the way journalists look at migration? Do you think that journalism, as we are doing now, more digital events, less travels, do you think this will actually impact the way people report on human mobility?
Well, so I think there's two different issues there, because I think what it's having is a realistic impact on human mobility. And so that in turn affects the way journalists talk about it. I mean, a lot of us are used to, especially within Europe, to get on a plane, not almost as often as I get a bus, but not far off. And all of that seems to have stopped. And then, of course, there's migration. There's a lot of talks about borders. There's a lot of bubble zones that are being created where certain countries allow from just their immediate neighbors. So, the whole issue of travel and entering and crossing borders has changed, and journalists in turn have to reflect that. Now, whether the changes will create a further hostility, we'll have to see. I think certainly what governments do in this case will be crucial. So the whole tracking and tracing issue will be crucial. And I think another thing in the narratives is that we don't have to talk about ethnicities but I think we should talk about places people are from. So to give you an example, there was a truth that the virus originated in China. So you don't, it's a detail of language, which I think actually matters. So you don't say we're going to stop the Chinese. You're going to say you're going to stop people who come from China, because at the end of the day, it was a geographical issue. You know, if you were in Lombardy, it didn't matter if you were Italian or not. You were in an area that was at a high risk with a high contagion rate. So I think those slight differences, I think journalists will be aware of and paying attention to. I do think the fact that now it's become a global pandemic means there's less of an issue of, you know, the initial blame game that there was at the start of the crisis. But I think all of it depends on what is put in place by the governments. And I think right now it seems very, very uncertain, and public opinion will play a part. And I think there will be one discussion for the developed world. So I think we're going to see one narrative about travel within the EU or, you know, Europe, and potentially a totally different one when it comes to travel outside of Europe, even though many countries have not had as high contagion rates as Europe. But I still think, you know, the borders will be strict.
Let's talk about your audience a little bit, because Al Jazeera, I think, was a very innovative network in bridging the gap between the Arab world, North Africa, the Gulf, and Europe. The audience is it's an international audience. You appeal to a very wide array of countries. So, but also you are involved in national media. So I'd like to ask you something quite specific. Do you think that the views and the attitudes of your audience, both as an Al Jazeera presenter and correspondent and an Italian journalist, have changed during the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to issues like migration?
So, as you mentioned, I've got a sort of dual career. So I'm a senior presenter with Al Jazeera, but because I'm originally from Italy, I do a lot of work in Italian national media. And obviously I've been I used to work for British media, and I've lived here for more than 25 years in London. So starting with Al Jazeera, have the views changed? So first of all, I would say that the Al Jazeera audience per se is more educated about the world, crucially more interested about the world. You know, I think interest is at the core of all of this. And so because they have the interest, they will read more, follow us more, and generally know more. But I would say that the fear that COVID-19 has brought about has been pretty universal. And you've seen borders go up, and, you know, very stringent migrant measures emerge across the world. And you've seen a lot of migrants in a lot of places around the world almost caught in a situation where they couldn't work, they couldn't go back home, and, you know, had relative access to healthcare. And I think that has been quite global, even in parts of Southern Africa, everywhere. So has it changed the attitudes to migration? I think in general, it's done because of the fear, and also the knowledge that we have a difficult economic time ahead. I think everyone is more fearful, and I think fear is always the precursor to, you know, some kind of resistance to outsiders. It's more like, you know, the whole let's take care of our own, that kind of narrative that you often have coming from nationalist parties. But I do also think it has brought up a lot of empathy. I do think the stories, I mean, they've really resonated with me, and I do think it resonated with viewers as well. You know, we are all at home, we are all, you know, desperately washing our hands, and all of a sudden you empathize in a way that perhaps you didn't before with people in refugee camps. I'm thinking of Greece specifically, just to keep it sort of within Europe, you know, where you don't just go to the nearest sink to wash your hands because they're under pressure. There's a massive queue. If you've got kids, you know, how do you socially distance? How do you wash your hands? How do you take care of the hygienic impact? And I think because I don't think COVID-19 was an equalizer, but I do think it made us all do similar things, the people that could and the people that couldn't. And all of a sudden, I do think the empathy was more felt. All of a sudden, I think a lot of people did think, actually sat down and thought, okay, what is it like to be in a migrant camp? Because all of a sudden we had to, you know, being at home was, you know, having a home was obviously crucial. So I do think, to look a bit on the positive side, that it heightened empathy, and it also heightened appreciation. I mean, here in the UK, the key workers, you know, every Thursday we go outside our houses and clap at 8 p.m., you know, for the health workers, but really key workers, the people that have kept the country going at considerable personal risk of contagion. So I think there is a level of appreciation there as well. So empathy, appreciation, but I do think we need to accept that there is an element of fear, that the future is very uncertain, and that migration issues may well suffer from it, both in the perception, but also probably in the actual legislation.
It's great to hear that you're mentioning feelings. You mentioned fear and you mentioned empathy. And what comes out of research, especially research on public attitudes and opinion about migration, especially after the so-called 2015 migration crisis, is that mostly policymaking has followed the feeling of fear and responded to feelings rather than so-called evidence. Now, you also mentioned the role of migrant key workers that certainly in the UK have helped creating a sense of empathy for the people and also for reporters. In the south of Europe, but also in Germany, we can look at key workers in the field of agriculture, where crops are pretty much maintained and worked by migrants flown over from other countries so that they would not go to waste. Now, in your opinion, do you think that the COVID-19 has somehow helped bringing up stories that bring empathy to people that would be somehow otherwise dormant? Do you think that these actually helped giving them some more spotlight?
Look, I think certainly in the UK, because, we still have Brexit going on, not that anyone has mentioned it in the past few months, but, this is the country where Brexit dominated the agenda for years. And there was a lot of emphasis on skilled and unskilled labor. So the narrative here from the pro-Brexit camp was, it's not necessarily just about lowering migration, it's about choosing who you let in, and we want high-skilled migrants. Well, guess what? Then COVID-19 happens, and you realize that actually you need people to deliver your food and your shopping, not quite as much maybe as lawyers, everyone has their role, but you certainly need those workers. And then of course there's the health workers that have that particular skill. So I do think there was an appreciation. And I do think it's stories, especially the ones that unfortunately died due to contagion, a lot of the health workers, it's when you connect on a personal level. And then you realize that it's not just about skilled labor, it's about people doing their bit, and especially at a time when, to take care of your grandmother, someone is risking their life. So I do think that had a huge impact on the way key workers are seen. And when it comes to public opinion, I mean, it was remarkable what happened here a few weeks ago, where basically there's this situation where migrant workers had to pay for the NHS, a surcharge, a yearly, that's National Health Service, people who sort of, passport holding British citizens, we pay through our taxes, and there was a system whereby migrant workers had to pay additionally. And there was such an outcry in public opinion, even from sections of the media that are normally more aligned with the government and normally more aligned with right-way thinking, that even though Boris Johnson at one point put his foot down and said, no, we still need to keep it, there was such public opinion against it, such strength of feeling, that in the end the government scrapped it, or extended it for a while, saying that if you are a migrant working for the National Health Service, you don't have to pay extra to then use the service that you have been risking your life for. And that's remarkable. I mean, the fact that public opinion really swayed that, and something that had been policy for a while. So that policy had been decided on. And then COVID-19 happened and views changed. And I think because a lot of people realized. So listen, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I think at the heart of all coverage of migration issues are personal stories. It's finding the person, their backstory, their emotion, and it's about connecting. You can talk about statistics all you like. It's never going to get through to the viewer or the listener or the reader the way it is when they just read a story about, a parent, someone taking care of their children, or whatever their situation is that you can relate to. And I think what COVID-19 did, and tragically often because it was health workers or key workers that ended up dying because of exposure, I think what it did is make that connection at a time when everyone feels vulnerable. And so maybe we are also reaching out on a more human level.
If you searched on Google today the words migration and Mediterranean, migration and Europe, you would pretty much be bombarded by images of an invasion. You would see arrows pointing at south of Europe, coming from the Mediterranean. And still, this narrative is so much related to the 2015 migration crisis, even though statistics confirm that the flows we saw 5 years ago are pretty much nullified today. We had a huge crisis in 2015 with over 1 million crossings, but today the situation seems way more manageable, but the narrative remains the same. Now, do you think there is an opportunity, using also, as you mentioned, positive stories, testimonials, empathy? Is there a way to move from migration crisis as a narrative to migration capital? And does COVID-19 actually bring up this opportunity?
Look, I think there is an in-between migration crisis and migration capital, right? I think there's two different narratives. So we mentioned 2015 and the COVID crisis, but I think the points that always, and that I always try to bring out in my journalism in Italy, first of all, this idea that a lot of Southern European countries have, that the whole of Africa is coming over. Most African migration is within the continent. Most economic migrants coming from Africa stay within Africa, and not just refugees as well from Africa. So this idea that the whole of Africa is coming over is in itself wrong. And I mean, you say statistics, and I said we shouldn't talk about numbers too much because they lose people, but that is very important. And then that's the economic migrant side of things. Then, of course, there was the refugees from the ongoing conflict in Syria, which is still not resolved. I mean, it's quietened from 2015, but up until not that long ago, there is obviously still a conflict. And I think, again, there the numbers is, well, try telling Jordan, a country, that isn't very big, that 1 million people is an invasion, because Jordan had as many refugees there that the whole of Europe. Try telling Turkey, for all the flaws of the EU-Turkey deal, they've taken more than 3 million refugees. So I think it was always those numbers, because I think there was a fear used by a lot of nationalist parties, absolutely, but there is this fear that people in Europe think, oh my goodness, Africa is so devastated by war and poverty, they're all going to come over, take what we have, there isn't going to be enough. And I think key to that is also, if we focus on the economic migrant issue, which I think is the one that potentially gets demonized more in Europe. So if you look at the economic migrant, I think it's also about showing Africa as the vibrant continent that it is. Yes, of course, there's parts of it that are blighted by poverty. And yes, of course, there are countries with wars that have been dragging on for ages. But the 80% internal mobility within the continent also shows you that there's lots of parts of Africa that are vibrant. And so I think it's about showing the countries of origin, the reasons why a lot of these, young or not so young people are choosing to come across. I think that is more how you fight it, necessarily how you fight the sort of stigmatizing than COVID-19. So if you see what I mean, I think that what we saw in 2015, you don't need COVID-19 to fight it. There was, in our information, in our communication, there's other points to bring up that I think would make it easier. Then, as far as migration as a resource, I mean, yes, absolutely. And then that goes back to to the point I was making earlier about using we call them test cases, which is an ugly way of saying we need to talk to people. So instead of like numbers and press releases, an actual interview with a person who tells you their story face to face. And the difficulty here for a lot of the European countries that we don't necessarily have on English speaking channels like Al Jazeera or the BBC or CNN is language, because there is the difficulty there. I remember a great advantage that Al Jazeera had when the migration flows were coming in from Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans. A lot of our correspondents speak Arabic. A lot of our correspondents would be able to tell you which part of Syria these people were from, and so could speak to the people. Now, with the best will in the world, I don't expect every correspondent for Italian television or any other, national television to be fluent in various types of Arabic. And so I think there is often a language barrier when it comes to getting through the Italian, the Greek, the Spanish audiences, which are exactly the audiences that we need to get through.
So you talked about linguistic divide. You talked about different audiences and how they can be addressed. And let me ask you a question coming from formerly another sort of bubble, another sphere where there doesn't seem to be a real strategy to change narratives, where narratives actually somehow need to be more balanced. Now, the Al Jazeera audience is very international, as you said, is highly educated, is more interested, I like that word, is more interested about the war at large, about global issues, certainly about regional issues in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Europe. Now, how can then people outside this sphere be reached in national languages? This is also a debate around the European Union. They often send pan-European campaigns in English that tend to reach certain bubbles. It could be the Euro bubble in Brussels, it could be Porta Romana in Milan, it could be Kreuzberg in Berlin, it could be the city of London. But then there is this huge divide between, let's call it, great urban centers and the periphery. Now, in your opinion, what can international organizations like the UN, like ICMPD, like the European Commission, that too often concentrate on pan-European, on global and pan-European and continental messages, but they fail to reach the people that somehow today are less informed about issues that are important for them. What would be your recommendation for these organizations as, as a communication experts like you are?
Oh, well, thank you. I hope so. So I think, and again, it's easier said than done, yeah, because all these organizations try their hardest. So, but in an ideal world, I think you have to be ruthless about keeping it local and about keeping it national, but even localized. So when I broadcast, I mean, I'm not a different person, as in my message is obviously more or less the same, but the way I relate to my audience, if I'm on Al Jazeera, or if I am on a national Italian channel, or if I am in some piazza in Italy, when we still used to do that at some conference, where you could relate with the audience, is almost completely different. And I think to succeed, you have to keep it at the very least national, because at a national level, the people organizing this, so let's say from the EU, will know what the counter narrative will be. And the counter narrative will always be different for every country. So the anti-migration narrative in the UK, for example, is different to the anti-migration narrative in Italy. There's different issues. So for the UK, it was a big thing about the EU, because of course, London is one of the capitals of the world. So a lot of EU citizens would go there. It would attract many more people than Rome, Paris, or Berlin ever could. In Italy, it was all about being abandoned by the EU and being the first point of contact for migrants coming in from Africa and the Middle East. And I just think you need to account for that. Otherwise, within reason, you're wasting your money. You're staying in your echo chamber. You will get lots of messages from people who think just like you, saying, oh, that was a great campaign, but that's not what you need. I think in this, social media is invaluable. There's very little, it depends who, but a lot of people stick with the newspaper they read and the TV channel that they have. And I think sometimes on social media, I mean, you get echo chambers there as well, but a lot of social media videos will still get reshared. I think they have slightly more chance of reaching beyond. I think you need to get to the people that, I wouldn't say hate you, but hate your message. And try to get, but to do that, you need to address in an almost detailed, specific way, what the counter argument being made by them is. So when I am in Italy, I know the anti-migration arguments off by heart. And if I go in any conference and no one's asked me those and I haven't had the time, not even to rebut, to dismiss, because, a lot of these arguments are not unfounded. Italians being angry about the EU not having decided to properly share migrants, it's not an unfounded per se racist opinion. It can be twisted, and often is, but I just think you can only do that if you tailor and target. It costs money. You need people that speak the language. And of course, it's funny, I always think on a media point of view, the Arab world is so split, so many countries, different religions, but they have the common language. So you can have an Al Jazeera in the Arab world. The EU, we have a proper political union, but we don't have a common language. And that has always been the Achilles heel of the European Union. And we need to counter that. And I don't think there's any way around it than actually using the specific, not just the languages. You don't just give this to translators. You give this to journalists who will tailor it so that the message gets to where it needs to get.
I would like to conclude this interview with one personal question. You have over 20 years experience in the field. What would you recommend to journalists that are about to approach this world, that are about to approach the Euro-Mediterranean region, they're about to approach two worlds, and they're about to approach an issue like migration today? What would be your main recommendations to them for the years to come?
Gosh, that it's going to be a story that will in some ways define your career. I think if it's someone starting out now, to get to know both sides, to travel. I mean, I know it's hard to say in post-COVID-19 times, but to go to places and to speak to people. To remember that there's more that unites us than divides us. I know this may sound a bit airy-fairy, but it's true. To do their homework when it comes to understanding the migrant flows, to always, to speak to as many people as possible outside of the echo chamber. Because even within, this world of journalists and, NGOs, and there is an echo chamber within that as well. So to step outside it, to always go on the ground and speak to people affected. There is never any excuse for not doing that. If you're ever doing a report on migration without a migrant in there somewhere, I mean, I know that sometimes it's unavoidable, heaven knows 24-hour news channels, we've sometimes, sometimes you need to put stuff out. But that is almost unforgivable. You always need to have the voices of the people that are affected. And also, and this may be hard, but in a way it shouldn't be, get to grips with what the criticism is. Ask the people that are against migration why, and listen to them, and don't automatically just dismiss what they're saying, because otherwise you lose the trust of viewers. And once you've lost the trust, anything you do is pointless.
Please, sorry, interrupted.
No, go on.
There is a lot of food for thought. It was a very enriching conversation. Definitely lots of recommendations that I will bring to our audiences and to the people belonging to our networks all across the Euro-Mediterranean region. Barbara, thank you very much for being with us, for taking the time to talk about your personal experience and your thoughts about the future and the impact of COVID-19 on migration and the Mediterranean and journalism at large. All the best from Malta, where I'm talking to you from.
Lucky you.
And thank you. It's been an interesting time, and we hope to be again in touch in the future, possibly within the next Champions of Migration event in Brussels at some point.
Yeah, we're not going to make plans at some point. I'll be there whenever we can. When I can get on a Eurostar, I'll definitely be there.
At some point.
Can I just add one tiny thing?
Absolutely.
Experts, so I spoke about talking to migrants, and then obviously often you speak to migration experts on TV. I think it is crucial to speak to people from Africa, from the Middle East. I'm not talking about migrants. I just mean people with local expertise. And I think sometimes there is, and again, it's the language thing. I can't tell you how many times we'll watch a report about migration in the Mediterranean, and then, as the expert, it'll be some professor from a university in the north of England. Nothing against professors from universities from the north of England, but, and there's a place for them, obviously. But why don't we get the professor from, I don't know, a university somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere in Africa? Or, I just think it's as part of the narrative, the issue of diversity is key, because you have to jump over the language issue. There are plenty of people, obviously, in Africa and the Arab world who speak immaculate English, and some who don't. And so I think you need to try to overcome that, because you need to hear different voices. And, it's all part of a big global conversation, and you're not going to have the global conversation unless you get voices from all over the world. And I have to say that is always what Al Jazeera's tried to do. Al Jazeera is the first and main international news channel based in the Middle East. And that is a strength. It's part of the narrative that needs to be heard. Otherwise, you're not really hearing the full picture.
I couldn't agree more. There is a need to expand everybody's vision, especially of the people working in this business. There is sometimes a tendency to close in and look at peer-to-peer consultations, especially with people that are closer to you, but they're not within the issue. And I think Al Jazeera has been paving the way for this approach to have a global vision on a regional issue, and on many regional issues actually. And absolutely, and looking at both sides of the Mediterranean with an open mind. Barbara, thank you so much.
Thank you.